The following episode features a historic article from the Nebraska History Magazine. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of its time, and while it offers valuable insight into the past, may contain expressions or viewpoints that are outdated or offensive by today's standards. Any outdated terms do not reflect the current views or perspectives of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Welcome to the Nebraska History Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goforth. Each episode, we explore articles written and published in Nebraska History Magazine. Radio has always played a role in connecting people. Early homemaker radio programs like Mary Moore Homemaker on WJAG in Norfolk focused their efforts on providing content and support for the women in their listening areas. Today, we explore the impact radio has played in connecting with and influencing women in Nebraska through the 2019 Nebraska History Magazine article, Stirring Up Conversation, The Radio Homemaker by Mark Smith and Larry Wacklin. The year is 1944. On a rural farmstead in northeast Nebraska, with no phone service, a wife is tasked with operating a household. A winter snowstorm means she won't make it to town for the foreseeable future. Her children and husband provide familial companionship and support, but the voices of other women are missing. But then, at the appointed hour, the household radio crackles alive each weekday with the sound of a female broadcast host whose cheery demeanor is a comfort to the homemaker. With the introduction of widespread radio broadcasting in the 1920s, the new medium had demonstrated it could overcome distance, galvanize personal connections with listeners, and ease isolation, particularly in rural Middle America. It did so largely through men who dominated broadcast ownership and programming. Within a few years, however, women began to make inroads on the air, talking to other women throughout the Midwest. Among the first such broadcasts targeted to homemakers was a show beamed to radios in the Twin Cities in 1924. Washburn Crosby, later known as General Mills and the maker of gold medal flour, produced a regularly scheduled homemaker program on a radio station the company purchased in Minneapolis. The Betty Crocker Cooking School of the Air, broadcast on WCCO, quickly connected with listeners. Within a year, the program expanded to more than a dozen stations on which multiple Betty Crocker hosts, furnished with scripts produced by Washburn Crosby, talked to other women. From 1926 to 1953, Betty Crocker shifted to national status on the NBC radio network, with multiple hosts over the years reminding homemakers, quote, how to buy, what to buy, and how to make the best with what is available, end quote. Marjorie Husted, a company employee who graduated from the University of Minnesota with a degree in home economics, not only had a major role in creating the Betty Crocker icon, but Husted also served for a time as the radio voice of the iconic homemaker. Similarly, the U.S. Department of Agriculture initiated a radio text service in summer 1926 that targeted a significant audience of women charged with caring for households. Local county agents, most likely men, produced advice broadcast scripts for Housekeeper's Chat, which featured a neighborly but patriarchal-sounding host, Aunt Sammy. Much like Betty Crocker, the personification of Aunt Sammy relied upon women stand-in hosts scattered among dozens of Midwest radio stations who dispensed recipes and advice on such home care areas as pest control, floor care, laundry, and food. Aunt Sammy quickly secured a loyal audience. Within a year of its first broadcast, the government offered publications designed to, quote, meet the enormous demand of the most popular recipes broadcast, end quote. Among the Midwest broadcasters that subscribed to the service was KOIL in Omaha, originally licensed to Council Bluffs, Iowa, KFAB in Lincoln, which later shifted studio operations to Omaha, and KMA in Shenandoah, Iowa. Increasingly, locally produced homemaking shows appeared in the mid and late 1920s on several Great Plains radio schedules in South Dakota, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri. By 1926, listeners could hear Stitch and Chat on KMA in Shenandoah and The Mother's Hour on rival KFNF. Both shows had laid the groundwork for regularly scheduled programming that attracted not only large audiences of women who raised children intended to Midwest households, but also revenue from local, regional, and national advertisers. Local homemaker shows, first on radio and later television, reached its zenith in the post-war years. The long-running programs not only opened the airways for women to produce and host radio shows in the Cornhusker State, but also new revenue streams for broadcast outlets, overwhelmingly controlled by men. Women emerged as personalities on Nebraska radio and television through different sets of circumstances. Georgia Crawford, a partner with her husband in ownership of KCNI in Broken Bow, produced and broadcast the Kitchen Kate program 5 days each week. By 1954, Crawford assumed the role of general manager and sole owner of the station after her husband's death. Billy Oakley, whose 60-year media career began in radio as a performer personality in 1932, produced homemaker programs for KMA in Shenandoah and KMMJ in Grand Island. Oakley's controversial delivery eventually paved a successful transition to television with a daily program on KOLN-TV in Lincoln. One of the best-known Nebraska homemaker producer personalities was Martha Bolson, who was active from 1938 to 1984. Bolson's program, distributed through the Omaha-based Harold Soderlund firm, was broadcast on 69 radio stations and 64 television stations in several states, as well on, at different times, all 3 Omaha commercial television stations. Bolson was an Omaha contemporary of longtime NBC Tonight Show host Johnny Carson from Norfolk, Nebraska, when both Bolson and Carson worked on Omaha stations WOW Radio and WOW TV. A homemaker program with a 26-year run secured strong connections with radio listeners in Northeast Nebraska. Eugene Gene Hughes, publisher of the family-owned Norfolk Daily News, was the driving force to secure a broadcast license in Norfolk, nearly 100 miles northwest of Omaha. The federal government granted a limited commercial land radio station permit to Hughes Publishing for WJAG in 1922. Women appeared on WJAG program schedules in the mid and late 1920s, mostly as entertainers like the Norco Feeds Girl and Marjorie Beeler and Frances Warner singers. Day-to-day announcing chores were largely confined to men. In a rare instance, Alice Van Aston briefly served as a WJAG substitute announcer. In 1930, WJAG tried to attract housewives with programs such as Omar Cooking School of the Air, sponsored by Omaha Flour Mills, and Shopper's Guide. These shows quickly faded, but by 1931, WJAG offered Housekeeper's Chat, Beauty Hints with Mary Reynolds, and Nancy Foster's Cooking School, sponsored by Nash Coffee. A March 1932 Norfolk Daily News ad said WJAG was, quote, looking for a woman in or near Norfolk who has had experience with chickens, end quote, for a 15 to 30-minute daily poultry program. Thomas soon hired a host for Poultry Lady and a sponsor, the Omaha Cold Storage Company. Soon, caring for chickens gave way to recipes and homespun conversation. In 1939, the first regularly scheduled homemaker program appeared on WJAG, Cousin Elsie's Kitchen. Host Elsie Ludke of Norfolk recalled that producing the 30-minute weekly program in her home, targeted to other homemakers, was strenuous, quote, when the cat and the dog had a fight on the air or the time when the baby attacked the microphone with a mixing spoon, end quote. Within a year, the show had transformed into a live studio presentation, but ended shortly thereafter. Ludke then joined the Breakfast Club team on WJAG. Cousin Elsie assumed an on-air role of serving and promoting coffee and pastries, sponsored by a coffee maker and local bakeries, to her male announcer counterparts. Maude Werner, who later became a radio homemaker on WJAG, described Ludke's combination of advertising and visiting on the Norfolk station as among the first of such local broadcasts by a woman to area homemakers. Although Ludke's participation in the program ended in 1940, the template had been forged for a permanent homemaker show aimed at Northeast Nebraska housewives. In late 1940, WJAG secured an Omaha advertiser interested in promoting a product line targeted to women. The station conducted auditions searching for a female host who would combine, quote, advertising and chatting with homemakers, end quote. In December, WJAG hired Edith Hansen of Norfolk to host the Mary Moore Homemaker show. Station records and interviews failed to reveal the genesis for an on-air moniker of Mary Moore or why Edith Hansen did not use her name. A Norfolk Daily News promotional ad promised, quote, a new and different kind of homemaker program on WJAG, end quote. The Monday through Saturday half-hour show from 9 to 9:30 in the morning with host Mary Moore would broadcast money-saving household tips, recipes, news, bargains, and the latest fashion trends. Hansen described the first broadcast as experiments, leaving her frightened and nervous. But soon, she came to feel as if she was sitting right in the kitchen exchanging recipes and ideas with neighbors. Station management urged Hansen to query the audience as often as possible to determine the direction of the program. When World War II began, nearly a year after the inaugural broadcast in 1940, government-mandated rationing meant that Hansen had to be more creative with the ingredients and recipes and meal preparation. She explained to listeners how to prepare sugarless recipes and how to find a substitute for that cup of coffee. In 1942, Hansen departed WJAG to replace Jesse Young, a radio homemaker on KMA in Shenandoah. The Kitchen Club show, ranked the second most popular show on KMA, conceded the number one position on station program listings to Leanna Field Driftmeyer's Kitchen Clatter. Hansen departed KMA in 1945, but returned nearly 2 years later to the same station. By the late 1940s, Hansen began to co-host a nationally syndicated homemaker program. With the departure of Hansen, WJAG needed a new Mary Moore. Friends of Maude Werner of Battle Creek urged her to pursue the homemaker position. She was initially hesitant about hosting a radio show, but did apply. Werner had acquired on-air experience, having participated in broadcast programs for local women's organizations on WJAG, coupled with a background in education. Born in nearby Stanton, she attended colleges in Wayne, Peru, and Fremont, as well as the University of Nebraska, and had served as a school principal. By the early 1940s, Leo and Maude Werner had set up a household in Battle Creek, 12 miles west of Norfolk, to purchase and operate a local grocery store. Werner and nearly 24 women had been invited to WJAG for auditions. Werner returned for further interviews and recalled Art Thomas and 2 male employees popping questions at me. The station had a new Mary Moore. Werner began hosting the show in May of 1942. Outgoing host Edith Hansen, a WJAG male announcer, and Thomas coached Werner on the finer points of producing a half-hour live studio broadcast. Werner confronted harsh Nebraska winters in treks to the station from nearby Battle Creek. In the 1940s, after several attempts by local residents, a 6th driver was able to deliver Werner to the studios 10 minutes into the scheduled start time of Mary Moore. On another occasion, Werner was not as fortunate. A January blizzard in 1947 left her snowbound in Battle Creek. Bob Verzel, a veteran WJAG announcer, conducted the show. After the broadcast, fellow employees teased Verzel with the new nickname Mary. Verzel was not the first male substitute host, of course. Not long after Werner began to produce Mary Moore, a new host suffered a 3-day illness, which forced WJAG male announcers to the microphone. In 1943, a lengthy ailment kept Werner from entering the studio for nearly 6 weeks. The wife of WJAG announcer Ken Myers, Olive Myers, appeared on Mary Moore with Werner composing commercial continuity from her bed. Myers produced the program with additional material from women's magazines, letters from listeners, and recipes from cookbooks. Throughout the 1940s, Werner broadcast Mary Moore live to Northeast Nebraska homemakers for 30 minutes a day, continuing Hansen's practice of presenting herself as a neighbor who visits via the radio, sharing recipes, household tips, product plugs, and homespun conversation. Art Thomas methodically exploited local media to keep Werner, aka Mary Moore, in front of Northeast Nebraska residents whom he coveted as potential listeners to sell to advertisers. Printed recipes, a station newsletter, and program offerings in the local newspaper provide early examples of media saturation. In the early years, the Norfolk Daily News, the co-owned publication of WJAG, promoted Werner through daily and years later weekly program schedules. In the 1940s, the station printed and distributed a monthly newsletter, WJAG News, to showcase its personalities, and a separate publication, Mary Moore's Prize Recipes. The latter publication consisted of a sponsored cover page, 2 pages of recipes, and the names of winners who submitted entries. Initially, Prize Recipes found its way to listeners each week, but soon shifted to a monthly schedule. Media industry practices and changing technology transformed the production process in the coming years. As early as the 1930s, KMA in Shenandoah initiated live homemaker broadcasts from the homes of Leanna Field Driftmeyer and Jesse Young, which other stations began to emulate. By the 1950s, quarter-inch electromagnetic tape recording technology meant that radio shows could be easily and cheaply stored. In January 1950, a promotional ad in the Daily News informed listeners that Moore would broadcast, quote, from her own home, end quote, in Battle Creek for 45 minutes each day, Monday through Saturday. The ad, which portrays Werner situated behind a microphone, failed to state that she had been coached to produce episodes of Mary Moore on a reel-to-reel recorder for later broadcast. Werner's husband, Leo, created an in-home recording studio, a room retrofitted with soundproof material designed to dampen unwanted voice reverberations. By 1953, Mary Moore returned to its original running time of 30 minutes for the next 13 years. The broadcasts generated thousands of listener responses and high-dollar regional and national advertising, a revenue bonanza for WJAG. Several companies purchased airtime over successive years on Mary Moore. Tidy House, the producer of the Perfex and Glosstex brands based in Shenandoah, lured the first Mary Moore of the early 1940s, Edith Hansen, who left WJAG for KMA to co-host a nationally broadcast homemaker show. In Norfolk, Robert E. Thomas, or Bob Thomas, who assumed general manager responsibilities of the 1,000-watt WJAG after his father's death in 1951, claimed that Tidy House sold products on Kitchen Club and on one other local radio homemaker show, Mary Moore, saying, quote, consistently, year after year, Mary would produce orders and sales volumes on the air that surpassed the achievement on other individual stations that were stimulated by this firm's own exclusive homemaker. Not only that, but Mary Moore would produce more orders per dollar spent than this firm's homemaker did on stations of 5,000 watts and even 50,000 watts of power, end quote. The successful homemaker show had achieved national advertising status by the 1950s. A publication targeted to advertisers nationwide promoted Mary Moore with the reminder that WJAG is, quote, represented by the Walker Company, end quote, an ad agency with offices in New York, Kansas City, and other metropolitan areas. Mary Moore generated revenue from a number of regional and national advertisers. Dizana Pancake Mix, Dwarfies, vitamin and wheat germ supplements, EZ on transfer patterns, Fairmont Foods of Omaha, Gingham Girl Furniture Polish and Floor Wax, Lastic Plastic Gloves, Mother's Best Flour, Nash's Coffee, and China Dish. Much of the financial success of Mary Moore emerges from a consistent pattern of connecting with listeners on a personal level. Episodes produced initially by Edith Hansen and longtime successor Maude Werner, along with Martha Bolson, Billy Oakley, and other Nebraska broadcasters who produced homemaker shows, did more than dispense recipes, advice, and pitch sponsored products. These women developed long-distance friendships with housewives. In a 1952 WJAG anniversary broadcast, Werner offered an example of homespun friendliness delivered in a warm conversational tone. Quote, "Life is made sweet by the friends and things in common we share. We want to live not because of ourselves, but because of the people who care. And the joys of this life, when you sum it all up, are found in the making of friends. That's why I like the Mary Moore program. That is why I've gotten so much out of it." End quote. The ubiquity of broadcasting further enhanced the image of Mary Moore as a friendly neighbor next door, a woman who communicated with other women, a rarity on radio program schedules in that era. Hansen said, quote, "Mary is a neighbor to so many people. You can depend on your neighbor coming in to the home via the radio, and that neighbor is Mary Moore. She always has a cheery message for you." End quote. Finally, technology fueled the success of radio homemakers in the 1950s. The availability of tabletop radios, an alternative to bulky living room sets, allowed women to work side by side with their favorite broadcast homemakers. Perceived individual connections between listener and host propelled Werner to regional celebrity status. WJAG mail counts demonstrate the potential of Mary Moore to galvanize listener response and revenue. With the exception of 1946, Werner, through the on-air persona of Mary Moore, generated substantially more mail from 1942 to 1950 than any other program, promotion, or advertised product. By late 1949, the mail count had nearly quadrupled in 7 years and was on track the first 6 months of 1950, the last year of available station data, to establish another record. To better understand the folksy appeal of Mary Moore in another context, the population of Madison County, Nebraska, at the center of WJAG's nearly 100-mile radius transmission signal, was nearly 24,300 residents in 1940. By 1949, Werner generated more mail than the entire county population. The increasing workload of preparing Mary Moore broadcasts forced Werner to utilize the services of production assistants, including Becky Peters. Besides heavy mail volumes and other program production duties, Werner was the star attraction of yearly Mary Moore picnics. In 1951, the second annual picnic attracted 650 listeners on a rainy Monday in the Norfolk City Auditorium. Werner conducted live broadcasts on WJAG as loyal listeners competed in several competitions: potato and backward races, horseshoe pitching, and a slipper kicking contest. Awards were presented to the oldest person present, Huldah Euchre, 84, from Norfolk, and the youngest newlywed, youngest baby boy and girl, and largest family, 7 children, by the way, and farthest distance traveled, Elba, Nebraska, 120 miles southwest of Norfolk. A similar outdoor picnic 2 years later attracted more than 500 listeners. WJAG seized on the popularity of its iconic radio homemaker in the 1950s with a nearly identical format but different host of a new weekday broadcast. A syndicated show, a departure from the locally produced Mary Moore, was recorded in Shenandoah, a hotbed of women's homemaker shows on KMA and KFNF. Jane's Journal, hosted by Jane Robinson and sponsored by Tidy House, featured, quote, 15 minutes of helpful hints, homemaking ideas, and new recipes, end quote. Jane's Journal began in 1952 and appears to have been short-lived. A January 1954 WJAG schedule fails to list the program. Industry practices, declining revenue, changes in lifestyle, and ambiguous federal regulations led to the final broadcast of Mary Moore in late 1966. After thousands of productions over a span of 26 years, with many of those broadcasts under the direction of Maude Werner, the then 73-year-old host retired in December. The station announced that it would not replace Werner, whose career began in the Hotel Madison mezzanine studio in downtown Norfolk and came to a conclusion with record broadcasts originating from the Werner home in Battle Creek. General Manager Bob Thomas blamed the show's demise on several factors, including a, quote, determined trend away from a homemaker program, such as she has developed for so many years, end quote. Thomas told listeners in a broadcast salute to Warner many stations that program similar homemaker shows, quote, no longer have such programming on the air. Then, too, this station maintains another extremely well-produced women's program, end quote. That program was Kitchen Clatter, produced in Shenandoah. The 30-minute daily show had appeared on WJAG program schedules on and off since the 1950s. Mary Moore's popularity, with listeners and advertisers, reached its zenith in the 1950s, a time of significant national economic expansion. By 1954, WJAG exploited Warner's popularity with two Mary Moore shows, the long-standing 30-minute broadcast at 9 a.m. and a 15-minute feature, The Brunch Hour with Mary Moore at 11. A review of available station revenue, however, signals a downward trend during the last decade of local homemaker broadcasts. Gross sales on Mary Moore in 1956 totaled nearly $10,000. By the end of 1960, revenue before expenses had plummeted nearly $3,000, a 30% decline. To enhance the declining revenue line, station accounting records document yet another program produced by Warner, an advertiser-supported garden show broadcast for a few months in 1957 and in 1958. By 1966, Warner's half-hour block of airtime, 6 days a week, was more valuable for new programming and revenue generation. Thomas said, quote, business matters, meaning daytime stations in particular must find ways to curtail costs and make most efficient use of every single minute of broadcast time, end quote. Finally, Thomas laid blame on the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC, and their regulations, strongly tied to the business side of broadcasting, for further exacerbating efforts to sustain a local homemaker show. The FCC raised its regulatory eyebrow over the industry practice of limiting the number of commercial minutes allotted to feature-length programs. Warner promoted numerous sponsors at length on each 30-minute broadcast. According to government regulators in that era, Warner's productions constituted program-length commercials, that is, a half hour of commercial matter per program. Because radio stations had to adhere to commercial time restrictions each hour, a 30-minute commercial would have exceeded federal government standards. Kitchen Clatter, the syndicated homemaker show that filled the void left by the departure of Maude Warner and Mary Moore, abruptly ended its daily broadcast in 1985. Not long after, Billy Oakley, a familiar voice to listeners in other Nebraska radio markets, served as host of a 10-minute syndicated show broadcast Monday through Saturday on WJAG, sponsored by the Extra Touch Company of Shenandoah. The ability of women to control programming was an important development in the history of radio, driven by station managers in Nebraska as lucrative financial opportunities. The image of women maintaining households may have been reinforced by early homemaker shows. However, radio operations in Nebraska sensed a niche, underserved audience, thus opening the door of broadcasting from program production to hosting for many women to explore. Because of the specialized nature of programming to women, the men who operated broadcast outlets granted almost sole content and production duties to the women hosts of homemaker shows. This effectively provided women with historic opportunities to produce broadcast programming out of the dominant shadow of male influences. WJAG manager Art Thomas nurtured the broadcast skills of the two hosts of Mary Moore. Beyond that initial coaching, much of show's resilience year after year lies with Edith Hansen and Maude Warner, whose hosting abilities and production techniques resonated with local homemakers. To be sure, the marketing image of Moore, constructed and maintained by Thomas and his son later on, Bob, was a focal component on the success of Mary Moore as well. Successful radio home advice programs with Nebraska ties, such as Martha Bolson and Billy Oakley, shifted to local television in Nebraska. WJAG did not transition Mary Moore to television or regional radio syndication. However, Maude Warner's daily production on WJAG is emblematic of the homemaker format that emerged on other Nebraska radio stations before and during the same era of Mary Moore. Whether on radio or television, changes in family lifestyles and more women working outside the home further impacted the decisions of many station operators to end homemaker programs. By the end of Mary Moore in the 1960s, according to Werner in a 1973 interview, the preparation of meals from scratch was not as common as Americans turned increasingly to convenience foods. More women entering the workforce meant fewer listeners for homemaker programs and, as a result, fewer advertisers. Nevertheless, revenue-producing, sponsored homemaker programs offered women such as Maud Werner and her broadcast contemporaries in Nebraska and the Midwest opportunities to become influential in their own right during the early years of radio. Thank you for listening to the Nebraska History Podcast. To learn more about Nebraska History Magazine, to listen to more podcasts, or to support our podcast by becoming a member of the Nebraska State Historical Society, go to history.nebraska.gov/podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and get notified when we release new episodes on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, I'm Chris Goforth.